Rina, do you think that there actually are chances for Democrats in states like Mississippi, in states where Democrats maybe wouldn't have necessarily competed? Because, I think there are some Democrats and there are some Republicans who would say, yeah, spend your money over here. You don't have as good of a chance.
Look, I'm not entirely sure I'm sold on this idea of replicating Zoran, because there was a youth and immigrant surge in New York City that nobody really saw coming. And that's just what happened in New York City. I mean, you saw turnout hit levels that hadn't been seen since the 60s. But I do also think it depends on who we're talking about here. There is, in Zoran Mamdani, seemingly a pragmatic bridge builder behind the radical label that's been given to him all these weeks, right? Because everybody has talked so much in these weeks about how Mamdani is a socialist firebrand who is, again, seemingly dividing the Democrats, but quietly he's been charming skeptics across the aisle. I mean, he sat down with President Trump post-election for what was described as a surprisingly cordial meeting. And there were no fireworks. There was just talk. But I think what was even bigger is that he pulled endorsements from influential Jewish leaders in New York City, despite the noise on foreign policy. So that's not fracturing the party entirely. That is actually smart coalition building in a city that's always been a melting pot. So if he governs with that pragmatism, watch how fast the boogeyman effect or the narrative of the boogeyman falls apart.
Yeah, Republicans have made clear that they want to use him the same way that they've used AOC in the past, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, as well as Bernie Sanders, as well as Nancy Pelosi in a lot of cycles. Kayvan Mamdani was able to do something Democrats running for midterm races dream of doing, getting big turnout numbers. A Gothamist analysis of turnout data shows that voters, specifically between the ages of 30 and 39, made up the largest share of a record-setting 2 million voters. Turnout among 18 to 29-year-old voters nearly tripled compared to 4 years ago, the largest increase of any age group. So what does Mamdani need to do to actually keep those young voters engaged? What do you think he can do more immediately to show that he's sticking to the promises he made to them?
Well, I actually think, you opened by talking about the block party that he's turned this inauguration into, and it's very reflective of something that came up during his campaign, which was that the canvassing felt like a block party. People would say that all the time, and I'm 32, which, isn't that young anymore, but I think that young people feel very isolated and very lonely, even in a great city like New York City. And so building community into his organizing was critical. It wasn't just about going viral online. And I think that was obviously one of the misdiagnoses of his success. It was about investing in local grassroots community in all sorts of fun and creative ways. And you can remember that scavenger hunt he had as well. So, of course, he needs to deliver on these policy wins. But the turnout is astonishing. And I will point out, it's actually a theory that I think other candidates in different races are trying to rely on now, right? That's basically Jasmine Crockett's theory of the case for her bid in Texas, that she can run up the numbers like never before and win with certain groups. So it's interesting to see that. I will say, to Rina's point of, are we going to see other Mamdanis in more red areas? I actually think, Afton Ben came pretty close to, at least, she made a 13-point gain in less than a year, pretty much, over what Trump did in Tennessee in that district. So I think we might have some optimism there on some of those races.
I just want to talk about what we're seeing on the screen now, which is images of if we could pull back up some of the ceremony, some officials were just arriving. There's Bernie Sanders with Attorney General Letitia James. I know that we also saw Eric Adams, former Mayor Bill de Blasio, and you can also see there behind Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, as they're all getting ready for this big inauguration, this big ceremony. Amanda, as Kayvan and Rina were laying out, they seem pretty optimistic that that Mamdani has a potential blueprint for other Democrats. I know you're optimistic there, too. I'm just curious if there's any words of caution that you may have for Democrats that are trying to exactly imitate or replicate someone like Mamdani.
You got to run for the place you're in. A candidate running for city council in Miami has got to talk differently than one running for school board in Anchorage. Run for something has worked with folks who've done both and every kind of place in between. You got to run for the place you're in. someone like Zoran maybe couldn't win in a place like Kansas, but someone like in Kansas maybe couldn't win in New York City. I think really making sure that as a national party, we are embracing all different kinds of candidates who are tight on values, but flexible perhaps on how those values show up as policies has to be our MO going into a year where if we field really good locally rooted candidates, we can absolutely win in long shot places. And I would continually posit, what's the alternative? We don't try. I don't want to be part of that. Any party that's not willing to fight hard for every kind of community.
What do you think are some of the biggest issues, other than affordability, which I know is the thing that the midterms are likely going to be about the most? But Amanda, what do you think are other things that Mamdani has talked about that would translate in places like Kansas or Tennessee or Mississippi?
Well, I can tell you the number one issue people have been signing up to run for office on, especially in the last year, but really over the last 9, has been housing. The cost of housing, especially from the perspective of a first-time home buyer or a renter, which for most young people is how they're experiencing the housing market right now. They can't afford to live where they want to live. We're also hearing people talk about healthcare. Just today, Trump and Republicans in Congress let the Obamacare subsidies expire, meaning healthcare costs are going to rise exponentially for many American families. But we're also hearing people talk about hospitals closing, about lack of doctors in communities. All of this really affects the way people are able to live. And the last thing I'll say is we're definitely hearing people talk about AI and technology, whether it's data centers that are pushing up the cost of electricity or the way that technology is coming up in schools around kids. It's a conversation that's happening, and it doesn't quite fall neatly on the same kind of partisan lines you might expect. So I think it's something we'll hear a lot of candidates, if they're smart, talk about this cycle.
I don't think we have an image of this, but Rina, I'm seeing on social media that Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia graduate who is held for deportation for his role in the pro-Palestinian protests, is spotted there at the inauguration, at this ceremony. Just obviously, Mamdani was someone who confronted Trump on immigration, on issues like Khalil stands for. What do you think that his relationship with Donald Trump is going to be like moving forward, how he's going to navigate that?
That's a tough prediction, and it's a loaded question that I think we need the full hour for. There's a lot of symbolism today, and as we're looking at these images on the stage, I find one thing quietly striking to me about today's ceremony and this imagery we're looking at is that there are no Cuomos or Kennedys on the stage or seemingly even in the crowd. I loved former Governor Mario Cuomo. As a young Republican, I looked up to him. His Tale of Two Cities speech, which addressed inequality in New York City, it's a speech that still gives me chills. And it warned again of inequality. And I think if we really sit here and think about it, for decades, New York politics felt like a family affair. Mario passing the torch to Andrew, echoes of RFK's legacy in every big race. Mamdani beating Andrew Cuomo not once but twice shattered basically that image, that entire thing. I mean, today we're looking at Bernie Sanders and AOC. It's the progressive movement's moment. It is not belonging to the old dynasties. And I think that is the thing we need to fixate on here. Because that's not just a win for the left. It's a sign of voters wanting fresh voices over familiar names, even ones with a storied history. But like I just alluded to, it's bittersweet for me because Mario Cuomo represented thoughtful, eloquent liberalism that inspired an entire generation.
Kaivan, Rina says it's the progressive movement's moment. I think there have been times when progressives have thought it was their moment before. Again, how does that progressive movement take on or handle President Trump heading into 2026 and 2028?
Yeah, I'm not sure that my read is that it's the progressive movement's moment. I think we just saw an election cycle where you had two moderate NatSec moms win the governorships in states where, they weren't deep blue cities like New York City. They were, purple states. And I think that's really what I see the direction of the party going in the next year for sure, and probably headed into 2028. A lot of folks are talking about a Gavin Newsom type figure. I'm not sure they've coalesced, maybe other than, rumors of AOC around who that progressive voice would be. I will say, though, it is interesting. Rena points out this sort of generational shift here, and yet I was struck that Bernie Sanders is being so featured because it kind of belies that. And it's interesting because Mamdani, I think, didn't just rehash what Bernie's movement was. He really built something new. And my read on it is actually there is division in the progressive movement already, and actually Mamdani's already spent some of his capital with the more far left base, right? Keeping on Commissioner Tisch, going and showing up in person to tamp down a DSA primary challenge to Hakeem Jeffries, walking back some of his language on defund police and certain things about, was he gonna disavow the phrase globalize the intifada? And his base, especially the online portion of the base, got very upset about some of those things. So I almost read it as kind of throwing a bone to that kind of group of people to have this be a really progressive day one start, because he's going to have to compromise a lot more if he's going to be the pragmatic leader that it seems he wants to be.
That's interesting. Mamdani may be forging his own type of progressive pathway, different from Bernie Sanders, into the future for the party. Will McDuffie, Mark Santia, Amanda Littman, Kai Von Troff, and Rena Shaw, thank you.